Welcome back to Reasons for Faith. This is our final session for the year, and today we're going to be talking about three different topics. Are science and faith compatible? Why is the church so hypocritical and judgmental? And how do I know God's will for my life? So we're going to be starting with, are faith and science compatible? Well, there is a common myth out there that Christianity has been a science stopper, that it opposes science, and that it hinders progress. So we're going to be taking a look at, is this true? So one of the things we need to understand is, what do we mean by the terms science and faith? Well, one of the things that's happened with the term faith has been commandeered by people that give it the wrong definition. For example, this is Peter Boghossian from his book, A Manual for Creating Atheists. He says faith is the word one uses when one does not have enough evidence to justify holding a belief, but when one goes ahead and believes anyway. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of Christians that believe this is a term for faith also, that we believe regardless of having any evidence. And hopefully, as we've been going over these last 6 weeks, you've seen that that's not the case. But on this view, faith amounts to just a wishful thinking, a pie in the sky. In other words, if you have no evidence, then you need faith. And if you have evidence, then no faith is needed. So faith is at odds with science, because science believes in evidence and faith believes in believing without evidence. Now, in logic, what they call this is a straw man fallacy. And what it is distorting or misrepresenting someone's argument to make it easier to defeat. So by saying faith is just blind faith, that there's no evidence for what we believe, we just believe it, this is a straw man fallacy, because it's much easier to defeat than what the real definition of faith is, or at least biblical faith. John Lennox puts it this way: faith is not a leap in the dark. It's the exact opposite. It's a commitment based on evidence. It is irrational to reduce all faith to blind faith and then subject it to ridicule. That provides a very anti intellectual and convenient way of avoiding intelligent discussions. So, what do we see in the Bible? What does the Bible say about this? Well, if we take a look at John 20:30-31, the Apostle John tells us why he's writing the gospel that he is, and his reason is to provide eyewitness testimony. So in that passage, it says, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So his point of writing the gospel was to give evidence for everything that they had seen and heard so that we might believe. It's not a blind faith. Even Jesus himself, when the religious leaders, if you remember when paralyzed man was being dropped through Peter's ceiling, and he was telling the paralyzed man that his sins are forgiven, the religious leaders complained because they knew that only God could forgive sins. So Jesus says, but I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the man, I tell you, get up and take your mat and go home. So he's saying, in order to prove this to you, I'm going to heal this man. So he's giving evidence to the fact that he is God and he has the ability to forgive sins. So biblical faith, and the better word for it is trust. Because the word faith has been so misused, trust is probably a better word for us to use. It's a deep trust and a reliance on God. And it's based on his character and his promises. We talked all about his character and his promises in previous sessions. and it's rooted in historical events, as we talked about when we were looking at the Bible and the resurrection. So, a better definition for faith, biblical faith, is trusting in what we have good evidence to believe. Now, when we talk about science, science is empirical evidence. So it's the things that we can see, touch, feel. It's the use of our five senses, especially for historical things where we can't run an experiment or anything. We take a look at what we see and what we can understand and come to a conclusion. There's also the scientific method, which is experimentation, that we can repeat and get. If we get the same results, we have a high confidence level that it's a good solution. But we also need to understand that it's tentative and it's evolving knowledge. So what they believed 100 years ago in science is not what they believe today. It's constantly changing the more new information comes in. So if someone says they have proof, typically they're overstating their case. They just have a high level of confidence in the results. And it's also philosophically embedded with naturalism or materialism, meaning they are looking for a natural or material solution to a problem, regardless of how ridiculous that solution might be. They will not entertain a supernatural solution to any of the problems. In fact, Richard Lewontin put it this way: our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to understanding the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated, just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So many think that as science progresses, religion and faith will decrease. So, for example, a lot of years ago, people thought lightning came from a lightning god and thunder from a thunder god. But using the methods of science, we now have come to understand where lightning comes from and where thunder comes from. So the material causes are slowly eliminating the need for the supernatural. So we don't need gods or gods anymore. We don't need the supernatural because we have science now. But that relegates God to the God of the gaps. This is a common term that gets used with people that are complaining about religion and science. What they're saying is that you have a gap in knowledge and you just insert God when you don't have a natural answer. It's kind of like a fill in the gaps kind of thing. And that it's an argument from ignorance. And it sounds like, we can't explain it, so therefore God did it. But in reality, that is not the case. Most of the arguments for the existence of God that come from science are not what we don't know, it's what we do know. And William Lane Craig, a young William Lane Craig, in this video is going to talk about this, actually using two of the evidences for God that we discussed early on in the class.
But I want to emphasize that in the arguments that I've given, I gave two scientific arguments, the first and the second. Now, of course, the ethical argument wouldn't be affected by what you're saying, but the first two were scientific, and they were based not upon gaps in our scientific knowledge, but rather on what the best of scientific knowledge does tell us, so that it wasn't an appeal to God to plug a gap or to fill in ignorance, but rather it's saying that the best scientific evidence we have indicates that space and time are finite in the past, that the universe did begin to exist, that it did have this incredible complex fine-tuning of the initial conditions there, and that these are signposts that point beyond it to some greater reality as its explanation. And I think whether these arguments are worthy or not Depends upon how convincing the evidence is that in fact the universe had a beginning and that it does have these complex initial conditions. And I think the evidence is quite good that it does.
As a matter of fact, over the last 100 years, the more science finds out, the more evidence that there seems to be for the existence of God. As we already talked about the beginning of the universe and the fine tuning of the universe, but we see a number of other factors in the universe itself that seem to point towards the existence of God. Plus, Darwin thought the cell was a very simple thing, but as we learn more about the cell, it is highly complex, more like a small city. And things like DNA, code coming from non intelligence, doesn't make a lot of sense. We always see coding come from intelligence. And life coming from non life, never been observed, and we're not getting any closer because the more we learn about the cell, the less we understand how it could have come into being from a non-living source. So in reality, faith and science are different, but they are overlapping domains. So when we take a look at it, science tries to explain how the world naturally works. So it has nothing to say about the supernatural. It's looking for the regularity of the universe, how it normally works without any intervention. Whereas faith is looking more for meaning and ultimate purpose. So, was Christianity a science stopper? Well, in fact, Christianity was the science starter. Modern science really owes its existence to Christianity. If we take a look at all these early Christian scientists and so many more, they were all committed Christians. C.S. Lewis put it this way: men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. And Rodney Stark says not only is there no inherent conflict between religion and science, Christian theology was essential for the rise of science. So when you take a look at it, it developed in Europe, but not in Africa, Asia, or India. And when you take a look at Asia, they were ahead in technology, well ahead of Europe. It was their understanding that because God is a God of order and a God of laws, that if they take a look into the universe, they expect to find order and laws in the universe. And it's propelled them well ahead of the rest of the world in the area of science. And early scientists saw it as an act of worship. As it says here, uh, Johannes Kepler said, I had the intention of becoming a theologian, but now I see how God is, by my endeavors, also glorified in astronomy. And Nicholas Copernicus said, to know the mighty works of God must be pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High. And it didn't stop with those early scientists. Christians have been scientists throughout the modern era. If we take a look at this list here, these are famous scientists with big discoveries behind them. George Lemaitre was a cosmologist and a Roman Catholic priest, and the hypothesis he proposed later became known as the Big Bang, and it laid the foundation for modern cosmology. Werner Heisenberg was a key pioneer of quantum mechanics. Charles Towns was a Nobel laureate in physics who worked on the laser and the maser. John Goodenough, another Nobel laureate in chemistry, was actually contributed to the knowledge and development of the lithium ion battery. And Francis Collins, who's a physician and geneticist, he headed the Human Genome Project that mapped out our DNA. And between 1901 and 2001, 56% of Nobel Prize laureates were Christian. Kind of bring it to a close is a quote from Sir William Bragg, where he says Christianity and science are opposed, but only in the same sense as that which my thumb and forefinger are opposed, and between them I can grasp everything. In our next video, we're going to be talking about why is the church so hypocritical and judgmental. See you in a little bit.